So from ancient Thunder Armour to beaky Corvus plates and the stylish new Mark X suits of the Indomitus era, let's talk through all the suits of power armour that have been employed by the Space Marines in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought it could be fun to do something a little different and talk a little bit about the lore, backstory and miniatures of each of the suits of power armour over the ages. In this video I thought we'd focus on the core classes of power armour as opposed to delving into Terminator plates or other interesting variants, and go through each of the marks of power armour in chronological order, starting with Mark I and moving forward to Mark X. First up in the marks of Imperial power armour is the Thunder Armour. This is ancient power armour developed by the techno-barbarian factions that dominated Terra before the Emperor's ascendance, and was utilised by his powerful but unstable Thunder Warriors to conquer the dystopia that was Earth around about the 30th millennium. The Thunderbolt insignia for the Thunder Armour was apparently the Emperor's original heraldry before the Imperial Aquila, often found on the breastplate. Compared with all the other marks of power armour that followed it, the Thunder Armour is the only one that isn't fully enclosed. It didn't need to be fully enclosed and be able to stand a vacuum due to fighting primarily on Terra's surface. All the suits of this armour didn't have powered legs, unlike the power-driven exo armour of all the later suits, and it was primarily used by the Thunder Warriors themselves, though a few earlier Astartes did use suits of this. This armour was considered an old relic form of armour even in the days of the Horus Heresy, never mind fast forward 10,000 years, though apparently some suits are reportedly maintained for ceremonial purposes. I don't believe that Games Workshop ever had large amounts of models of these produced. I believe this sculpt is the only major one that we have of it, designed by Jez Goodwin sometime in the early 1990s. The second mark of power armour was the Crusade armour. This was kind of the first true class of Astartes power armour and developed at the launch of the Great Crusade, issued to the legions before they had their Primarchs, and for that reason was the most common type of armour found in the early Great Crusade, though it was gradually replaced by the latter marks as the days wore on. Towards the end of the heresy, only some legions were largely equipped with this, mainly the ones that had been fighting far from common supply routes or having to fall back on it for necessity. This one, unlike the Thunder Armour, is fully enclosed, meaning that it can allow the bearer to fight in a vacuum or in hostile environments, and it features hooped armour plates particularly visible around the legs, allowing for far greater mobility than some of the other later classes of armour, though at the expense of it being very hard to maintain and replace. The cooling cables and coils are also fully enclosed under the chest plate of this armour, something that's generally been a weak point of the later classes of power armour, having important technical pieces on the surface of the plate. Considering this armour was kind of supposed to be in pretty good supply during the heresy, and there would have been lots of suits of it kicking about, it's perhaps a little bit underrepresented in Games Workshop's model line. Over the years it's only really had a few Forge World kits to allow you to play it in-game in the more contemporary 40k releases. The third mark of power armour was the Mark III Iron Armour. This one wasn't necessarily an upgrade to the Crusade armour, but more of a specialist armour variant of this, designed for fighting in close conditions, either in breaching actions or when cover's limited, or perhaps to storm enemy fortresses or fortifications. The primary difference of this one to the Crusade armour is that it's largely up-armoured at the front plates, featuring extra plating around the chest, torso and legs, and that very cool industrial sort of looking visor is angled to aim to better deflect front-on impacts to the helmet. The compromise for this one is that it is lower armoured at the back, vulnerable to being flanked, so perhaps isn't quite as good general purpose armour compared with the Crusade armour. It is also a slightly heavier armour mark that's a lot slower and requires more power. It also certainly saw some fairly widespread use, perhaps quite popular amongst certain legions like the Death Guard. This armour mark certainly had a lot more support compared with the Mark II armour. I think looks-wise it's quite a popular one, really quite striking, and definitely feels like a bit more of a relic early production armour mark compared with some of the more modern designs. As well as that Ultramarines plastic kit previously pictured, Games Workshop have recently remade it for the upscaled Space Marines of the new Horus Heresy, first launching in that Legions Astartes battle group force that they came out with not so very long ago. The now retired model for Sergeant Cronus of the Ultramarines also fought in Mark III Iron Armour as well. I guess the Ultramarines, among many, having lots of access to well-maintained old tech. The next armour mark was the Mark IV Maximus armour. This was developed centrally by the Mechanicum to try and replace and maintain the Mark II armour that it transpired that legions were rapidly getting damaged and struggled to keep on top of supplies for. The development of it used many technologies developed by worlds conquered or rediscovered during the Crusade, able to use lighter materials that still provided adequate protection, exposed power cables but somewhat up-armoured compared with previous marks, and this was generally aimed to be the armour mark to replace the Crusade armour en masse, entire legions being issued with this gradually, though the War Master Horus coordinating the resupplies was very sure to make sure that his loyal legions were the ones that received preferential supply. In general, this was seen as superior to the Crusade plate, though it did come with some compromises such as the larger, flatter armour panels not being quite as manoeuvrable, even if the armour was light and well powered. The Mark X armour of the Primaris Marines would also draw inspiration from this one, the helm being notably similar to the Tacticus armour of modern-day Space Marines. Again, compared with some of the other marks for the Horus Heresy range, this one's one of the better supported armour marks, a few different variants, and a current plastic kit, though maybe a slightly older one compared with the Mark VI or the Mark III. Next up is the Mark V Heresy Armour. This armour mark was kind of named retroactively after many local variants sought to try and maintain adequate power armour supplies when their Crusade armour was failing, but central supplies of the Mark IV armour were disrupted due to Horus's treachery and the Emperor's entire domain being thrown into vast disarray. It certainly wasn't seen as any sort of step up compared with the Mark IV armour, and lots of design compromises had to be made. The notable thing about this armour, though, was that many different chapter artificers decided to use large amounts of molecular bonding studs to increase the amount of armor plating on the suit, aiming for the more heavily armored suits being extra hard to destroy by the attacks of enemy Space Marines. Bearing more armor, though, did mean that the suits tended to be less reliable, a lot heavier, and more chance of overheating, and again had the issue of exposed cabling, which seems to be an issue of every second power armor suit here. The helms of their Heresy armour were sort of adapted from supplies of the Tactical Dreadnought armour, featuring some enhanced sensory gear. Given that this was supposed to be one of the most common types of armour marks of the Horus Heresy, it's again perhaps surprisingly underrepresented. It's one of the ones that's never had a plastic kit and hasn't really got all that much representation out of the resin miniatures. I'm not sure if that's partly due to the studded design maybe being a little bit more niche appeal compared with some of the classic other armour marks. In any case, Games Workshop does seem to have developed this one a bit less than most. Moving on to the Mark VI plate, and Mark VI was the beaky Corvus armour. This one was aimed to be a permanent design to replace the Mark IV armour when the manufacture of such was disrupted in the Heresy. The Corvus armour was named for the Raven Guard's Primarch and primarily issued to the Loyalist legions, centrally being manufactured by the Mechanicum, though the Alpha Legion did manage to acquire the secret of making this and was able to supply themselves with the designs. For notable features of the armour, there's the distinctive beaky helm, certainly harking back to some of the earliest days of plastic Space Marines, and the lore supposedly housing more advanced sensory equipment. For the power supply, it features a dual power cable routing for increased reliability should one of them fail, and slightly heavier armour plating around the legs. The Mark VI armour was the primary focus for the most recent Heresy era reboot, with the Age of Darkness box set featuring a vast amount of these. It's maybe kind of interesting seeing them fielded quite so en masse for the traitors, given that they were a little bit more limited to the loyalists. The Mark VI armour was also basically the armour that was featured on the very first plastic Space Marines. The classic RTB01 Space Marines here feature the plate, and like more current versions of it, they also feature all the bonding studs on the left shoulder pad. I feel like this armour and then all the ones that preceded it are kind of things that are retroactively added to the 40k lore a little bit and were just generally all accepted to be established armours, and then the things that came after it have actually developed a bit more as Warhammer 40k matured. Speaking of which, here's the Mark VII Aquila or Imperator armour. This is perhaps the most iconic Space Marine design, the one that prior to the launch of Primaris around 7 years ago would be the absolute iconic Space Marine silhouette, and it has the distinctive angry-looking box grille on the front of the helmet. In the lore, it shares most of its design features with the Mark VI Corvus armour and was developed in the last stages of the Heresy by tech adepts evacuated from Mars. Apparently some of this was deployed during the Siege of Terra and the conflicts that followed it. A notable thing for this armour is that it features the sculpted Imperial Aquila across the chest, again the chest plate trying to cover up that vulnerable cabling once more. the Emperor decreeing that all the Astartes loyal to him could wear the Imperial insignia as opposed to just the Emperor's children. The Mark VII armour is aimed to be quite good at being backwards compatible, designed to be able to work with plates and pieces from the previous armour marks, and it does mean that sometimes veteran units within this armour mark might have a mix of different plating incorporated into the same suit. The classic Space Marine look still remains very much on sale, with the tactical Space Marines and Devastators in current 40k, but they seem a little bit more relic and niche compared with the newer Primaris suits right now. It'd be kind of weird if these ever get to the point where there's no longer these on sale by Games Workshop at all. I believe that these were partly redesigned to try and make the Corvus beaky armour look a bit more aggressive, essentially kind of chopping off the beaky helm part of it and giving you an angry looking box grille instead. The 8th mark of power armour is the Errant armour, supposedly the only armour mark developed post-Heresy but before the era Indomitus, and focused on covering just a couple of major weaknesses by the Tacticus plate, again fiddling around with those power cables that were present on sort of the abdomen sort of plate of the Aquila armour, and they also featured an up-armoured section around the neck, attempting to protect the vulnerable neck joint, perhaps one of the single weakest parts of the previous suits. I do feel like quite a lot of this story of power armour is basically Space Marines deciding on how best to hide their power cables. Perhaps this is the suit where they finally get it right. The Errant armour never really saw mass production. Typically full companies or chapters weren't equipped with this, and the suits that were able to be manufactured and maintained were generally given to veterans or commanders. Many of the suits incomplete and using parts from older armour marks, despite having less backward compatibility compared with the Mark VII. The development and rollout of the MkIII armour was largely ceased with the arrival of the Primaris Marines. Before we get to them though, there does seem to be a mystery baked into this power armour sequence. The painfully slow rollout of MkVIII armour was sort of supposed to represent the technological stagnation of the Imperium, which does seem to have changed a bit in the more current era with Cole's Primaris project and all the fancy new toys of the Indomitus era. However, when Primaris Space Marines started appearing, they were clad in Mark X armour as opposed to the Mark IX that you'd probably expect. At least to my knowledge, Games Workshop haven't given any lore reason as to why it seems to have been skipped. At least at the moment it looks like it's one of the mystery gaps in the 40k lineup, maybe similar to the Forgotten Primarchs out of the 20. I guess it always exists as a gap out there that Games Workshop could choose to fill at some point. I guess if they dream up something fun to do with it could appear in Imperial armies in one way or another. Not sure if that would be too likely to happen though, given that the Mark X armour is really quite flexible. Speaking of which, Mark X is the Primaris pattern of power armour. The most standard intercessor style pattern of this armour is the Tacticus plate. When Games Workshop unleashed the big model and lore changes that were Primaris Marines in 8th edition 40k, the supposed lore was that they were commissioned by Guilliman post-Heresy and quietly worked upon by the upper echelons of the tech priests, particularly Belisarius Cawl, alongside his Primaris project. With Guilliman's return, he had enough authority to push through these new designs in the face of imperial dogma and bureaucracy, which might have seen them rejected and purged. The Mark X armour most notably draws on the plates of the Mark IV and the Mark VIII designs, featuring up-armoured protection for everyone's favourite power cables, and as mentioned, the helm is very reminiscent of the Mark IV. Perhaps the biggest innovation of the Mark X armour, though, was the idea that they would be different suits depending on the squad's role, able to manufacture lighter Phobos armoured suits or up-armoured heavy Gravis armour, depending on if the squad was a lighter armoured recon unit or a heavily armoured elite breaching force. The models were certainly upscaled compared with the rest of the Space Marines. They were sort of Games Workshop delivering on true scale Space Marines, which some people had wanted for a while. With the current scaling, it did seem that the standard Space Marine didn't really stand much higher than your average infantryman from the Imperial Guard. As mentioned though, the Mark X plate does have lots of different variants. The heavily armoured Gravis armour features a lot more protection, massively armoured plates, plus an enclosed cowl that goes around the head and can fully enclose it. The lighter armoured Phobos armour features slimmed down armour plates that you can see on the legs for this Reaver, plus just the one pauldron that you could angle towards the direction of attack, and perhaps the only other major variant with a current plastic kit is the Omnis armour worn by the Suppressors, an interesting hybrid armour mark developed for supporting Phobos Space Marines. There's some design features from Gravis, Tacticus and Phobos armour here, and they're borne aloft on jump packs and grav plates. I guess we'll see where Games Workshop takes Space Marine power armour next. Obviously, there's many other power armor variant types that I didn't touch on here. The iconic tactical dreadnought armor of the Terminators has plenty of its own designs. The Grey Knights have their Aegis armor. Various types of artificer armor exist, particularly the Salamanders famed for this. And there's the enormous Space Marine Insider Space Marine exosuits that are the Centurions. In any case, hope you've enjoyed a quick breakdown of some of the major types of armor for the Space Marines in 40k. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Which types of armor do you like the look of the most? And I'd be interested to hear if you think the Games Workshop will develop any other types of Mark in the future, either fleshing out the Mark IX or going for wilder designs based on the Mark X. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day, generally talking about the gameplay or Games Workshop's model releases. I do like to do the occasional lore video from time to time though. Finally, if you have been watching my videos a lot and getting some good value out of them, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all of these coming. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.